comment about privilege would trigger the most shocking meltdown in talk show history, turning a routine interview into a career-defining disaster that no one saw coming. The studio lights were blazing hot that Tuesday morning as Howard Stern adjusted his headphones and glanced at his notes one final time. Across from him sat Meghan Markle, perfectly poised in a cream-colored blazer, her hands folded delicately in her lap. The interview had been months in the making. Her team had negotiated every detail down to the water temperature and the exact angle of the lighting. "So, Meghan," Howard began, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly tone that had made him a household name, "you've talked a lot about finding your voice since stepping back from royal duties. What does that actually mean to someone like me who grew up in Roosevelt, Long Island, working for every dollar?" Meghan's smile flickered for just a moment before returning to its practiced brightness. "Well, Howard, I think everyone has their own journey of self-discovery. Mine just happened to be more public than most." "Right, but let's get real here." Howard leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the desk. "You married into one of the wealthiest families in the world. You lived in palaces. Most people listening to this show are worried about paying their rent next month. How do you connect with that?" The temperature in the room seemed to shift. Meghan's posture straightened, and something harder crept into her voice. "I think that's a very narrow way of looking at things, Howard. Wealth doesn't protect you from emotional pain or mental health struggles." "Nobody said it did," Howard replied calmly, his hands spreading slightly. "But it sure makes those struggles easier to deal with when you've got a team of therapists on speed dial and houses in multiple countries." Robin Quivers, Howard's longtime co-host, could sense the tension building from her booth. She'd seen Howard navigate tricky interviews for decades, but something about Meghan's energy felt different. There was a defensiveness there, a wall going up in real time. Meghan forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow through the studio speakers. "I think you're making assumptions about my life that aren't accurate." "What assumptions?" Howard asked, genuinely curious. "You've talked openly about your struggles, which I respect, but you've also lived a life of incredible privilege." "Both things can be true." "Privilege." Meghan repeated the word slowly, like she was tasting something bitter. "That's interesting, coming from someone who's made millions talking into a microphone." Howard chuckled, completely unfazed. "Touché. But I never pretended I wasn't lucky. I never acted like my success was just about my struggles. I had advantages, I used them, and I'm grateful for them." "And what makes you think I'm not grateful?" Meghan's voice had developed an edge that made Robin shift uncomfortably in her seat. "Nothing," Howard said simply. "But when someone asks you about connecting with regular people, and your first instinct is to deflect rather than acknowledge your advantages, it makes people wonder." The silence that followed lasted exactly 5 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Meghan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost all warmth. "I don't think you understand what it's like to have your entire life dissected by people who don't know you. To have every word twisted and every action questioned." "Actually, I do," Howard said quietly. "I've been doing this for 40 years. I've been called every name in the book, been sued, been protested, been banned from radio stations. The difference is, I never expected sympathy for it. So now I'm asking for sympathy?" Meghan's voice rose slightly, causing the sound engineer to adjust his levels. "No," Howard said, his tone remaining steady. "But you're deflecting again. Look, I'm not trying to attack you here. I'm trying to understand how someone in your position relates to people who are struggling to make ends meet." Meghan uncrossed and recrossed her legs, a gesture that seemed calculated but betrayed her growing agitation. "I think the real question is why you feel entitled to judge how I handle my platform." "Entitled," Howard repeated, raising an eyebrow. "That's an interesting word choice." "Is it?" Meghan shot back. "You sit here in your studio, making millions, passing judgment on people's lives and experiences, and you don't see the irony in questioning someone else's privilege?" Robin could see where this was heading, and she tried to step in with a gentle redirect. "Maybe we could talk about your current projects, Meghan. I know you've been working on some exciting new ventures." But Meghan wasn't having it. Her focus remained laser-focused on Howard, her earlier composure completely abandoned. "No, I think this is exactly the conversation we need to have. About media personalities who think they can dissect people's lives for entertainment." Howard leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but alert. He'd handled hostile guests before, but something about this felt different. There was a personal venom here that surprised him. "I'm not dissecting anything," he said carefully. "I'm asking questions. That's what interviewers do." "Questions," Meghan laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Is that what you call this? Because it feels more like an interrogation designed to make me look bad." "The only person who can make you look bad is you." Howard replied, his voice still level but with a subtle firmness that his regular listeners would recognize. I ask the same kinds of questions of everyone who sits in that chair. Do you? Meghan challenged. Do you ask male guests to justify their privilege? Do you question how they connect with regular people? Actually, yes, Howard said simply. I asked the same questions of Prince Harry when he was on the show last year. The mention of her husband seemed to strike a nerve. Meghan's eyes flashed, and for a moment, the careful media training that had carried her through countless interviews seemed to evaporate completely. Don't bring Harry into this, she said sharply. I'm just saying, these aren't personal attacks. These are the kinds of conversations I have with public figures who talk about social issues and connecting with regular people. Right, Meghan said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. And I'm sure you gave him the same treatment you're giving me. Howard paused, studying her face. In 40 years of interviewing, he'd developed an instinct for when someone was about to cross a line they couldn't come back from. He could see it in Meghan's eyes now. That particular kind of anger that made people say things they'd regret. Meghan, he said quietly, maybe we should take a breath here. But it was already too late. The fuse had been lit, and there was no stopping what came next. Don't patronize me, Meghan snapped, her voice cutting through the studio like a blade. The careful composure she'd maintained for the first 20 minutes of the interview had completely shattered. I don't need you to tell me to take a breath. Howard held up his hand slightly, a gesture meant to calm, but Meghan interpreted it as condescending. Her eyes narrowed, and Robin could practically feel the temperature in the room drop another 10 degrees. I'm not patronizing anyone, Howard said, his voice still remarkably steady. I'm trying to keep this conversation productive. Productive for who? Meghan shot back. For your ratings? For your little sound bites that you can play over and over again? For everyone listening? Howard replied simply, including you. That seemed to be the final straw. Meghan leaned forward in her chair, her voice rising to a level that made the sound engineer wince. You know what, Howard? I came on this show as a courtesy. I didn't have to be here. Nobody said you did, Howard responded, his tone beginning to show the slightest edge of impatience. But you are here. So maybe we could try to have an honest conversation instead of turning this into some kind of victim narrative. Victim narrative? Meghan's voice cracked with indignation. Did you just say victim narrative? Robin tried once more to intervene, her voice coming through the speakers with practiced calm. Maybe we could talk about your upcoming projects, Meghan. I know our listeners would love to hear about what you're working on. No, Meghan said firmly, not even looking toward Robin's booth. Her entire focus was on Howard, and there was something almost predatory in her gaze. I want to address what he just said. Victim narrative. Explain that to me, Howard. Howard sighed, and for the first time since the interview began, he looked genuinely tired. Look, Meghan, I've been doing this for 4 decades. I've talked to thousands of people. Some have been through hell and back. Some have lived charmed lives. Most are somewhere in between. What I've learned is that everyone has struggles, but not everyone tries to make their struggles everyone else's problem. And you think that's what I'm doing? Meghan's voice was getting louder with each exchange, her media training completely abandoned. I think Howard said carefully that you came on this show expecting softball questions and praise, and when you got actual journalism, you decided to make it about how unfairly you're being treated. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the usual background hum of the studio equipment seemed to fade away. Meghan stared at Howard with an expression that mixed shock, rage, and something that looked almost like betrayal. Actual journalism, she repeated slowly, her voice now deadly quiet. Is that what you call this ambush? Ambush? Howard's eyebrows shot up. Meghan, I asked you how you connect with regular people. That's not exactly a gotcha question. In a tone that suggested I don't, Meghan fired back, with implications that I'm out of touch and ungrateful. I didn't imply anything, Howard said, his patience finally showing signs of wearing thin. I asked a direct question. If you heard implications, maybe that says more about your own insecurities than my interviewing style. That hit home. Meghan's face flushed, and when she spoke again, her voice was shaking with anger. My insecurities? Are you serious right now? Dead serious, Howard replied, his own voice hardening slightly. Look, I get it. You've been through a lot. The media has been brutal to you in many ways. But you can't use that as a shield against every uncomfortable question for the rest of your life. Shield? Meghan practically shouted the word. You think I'm using my trauma as a shield? I think, Howard said, his voice growing colder, that you're so used to being handled with kid gloves that you don't know how to have a real conversation anymore. The studio fell into another terrible silence. Robin was frantically gesturing to the producers through the glass. But Howard seemed oblivious to everything except the woman sitting across from him, whose carefully constructed public persona was crumbling in real time. "How dare you?" Meghan whispered, her voice barely audible but somehow more menacing than when she'd been shouting. "How dare you sit there and psychoanalyze me like I'm some kind of case study?" "I'm not psychoanalyzing anyone," Howard said wearily. "I'm just trying to understand why a simple question about privilege has turned into World War III. Because it wasn't a simple question," Meghan exploded, slamming her hand on the small table next to her chair. The sound echoed through the studio like a gunshot. "It was an attack disguised as journalism." "An attack?" Howard repeated flatly. "Meghan, do you hear yourself right now? Do you understand how you sound? I sound like someone who's tired of being disrespected by men who think they can tear me down for sport." "Men?" Howard's voice sharpened with genuine surprise. "So now this is about gender?" "Everything is about gender when you're a woman in the public eye." Meghan shot back, her voice rising again. "Especially when you're a woman who dares to speak up for herself. Speaking up for yourself and having a meltdown on live radio are two very different things," Howard replied, his tone now carrying a warning edge that longtime listeners would recognize. "Meltdown?" Meghan's voice hit a pitch that made Robin physically recoil in her booth. "Did you just call this a meltdown?" "If the shoe fits," Howard said quietly, and Robin knew immediately that he'd crossed a line he shouldn't have crossed. Meghan went absolutely still. For a moment, she looked like a coiled spring, every muscle in her body tense with barely contained fury. When she spoke again, her voice was so low and controlled that it was somehow more terrifying than her shouting had been. "You know what, Howard? I've heard enough. I've sat here and listened to you disrespect me, dismiss my experiences, and now you're calling me unstable. I don't have to take this." "Nobody's calling you unstable," Howard said, but his voice lacked conviction. He could see what was coming, and for perhaps the first time in his career, he wasn't sure how to stop it. "Really?" Meghan stood up abruptly, her chair rolling backward and hitting the wall behind her with a loud crash. "Because that's exactly what meltdown implies, isn't it? That I'm some hysterical woman who can't handle a tough conversation?" "Meghan, please sit down." Robin's voice came through the speakers, gentle but urgent. "Let's all just take a moment." "No," Meghan said firmly, beginning to remove her microphone with sharp, jerky movements. "I'm done taking moments. I'm done being reasonable with people who have no intention of treating me with basic respect." Howard watched her struggle with the mic pack, his expression unreadable. "This is exactly what I was talking about," he said quietly. "This reaction, right here. This is why people have trouble connecting with you." Meghan froze, the microphone cable tangled in her hands. She turned to look at Howard with an expression of such pure hatred that even he, veteran of countless on-air confrontations, felt a chill. "And this," she said, her voice dripping with venom, "this is exactly why people think you're nothing but a shock jock who peaked 20 years ago." The words hung in the air like poison. Robin gasped audibly through the speakers. Even the usually unflappable sound engineer looked up from his board with wide eyes. Howard sat perfectly still, his face a mask of controlled calm, but something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. "Excuse me?" he said very quietly. "You heard me," Meghan continued, her voice growing stronger as she sensed she'd finally landed a blow. "You're a has-been who thinks attacking women makes you relevant again. Well, congratulations, Howard. You got your moment. I hope it was worth it." She finally freed herself from the microphone and threw it onto the chair behind her. The feedback screech that followed was nothing compared to the silence that descended on the studio as she grabbed her purse and headed for the door. "Meghan?" Howard's voice cut through the studio like a steel blade, stopping her just as she reached for the door handle. She turned back, expecting to see defeat in his eyes, but instead found something far more dangerous: absolute calm. "Before you go," Howard continued, his voice so controlled it was almost whisper quiet, "let me tell you something about being a has-been." Meghan stood frozen in the doorway, her hands still on the handle, suddenly unsure if leaving was the power move she'd thought it would be. "A has-been," Howard said, settling back in his chair with deliberate ease, "is someone whose best days are behind them, someone who peaked and can't accept that the world moved on." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Now, I've been number one in this market for 30 years. I have a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I interview presidents, movie stars, and yes, even royalty, because they need me more than I need them." Robin held her breath in her booth. She'd seen Howard angry before, but this was different. This was surgical. "You, on the other hand," Howard continued, his tone remaining conversational despite the venom in his words, "walked away from the most privileged position in the world, burned bridges with your own family, and now you're doing podcast interviews and morning shows trying to stay relevant. So between the two of us, who exactly is the has-been? Meghan's face went through a series of expressions: shock, rage, and then something that looked almost like panic. She'd expected him to be hurt by her insult, maybe even to lose his temper. She hadn't expected him to calmly dismantle her with facts. She started, but her voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again. That's not fair. Fair, Howard laughed, but there was no humor in it. Meghan, you just called me a washed-up shock jock on my own show. You stormed around my studio like a toddler having a tantrum. You threw equipment. And now you want to talk about what's fair? I didn't throw anything, Meghan protested weakly, but even she seemed to realize how pathetic the denial sounded. The microphone would disagree. Robin's voice came through the speakers, gentle but pointed. Meghan spun toward Robin's booth, her eyes blazing. Don't you start too. I'm not starting anything, Robin replied calmly. I'm just observing that for someone who talks a lot about being misrepresented in the media, you're doing a pretty good job of representing yourself poorly right here. The observation hit Meghan like a physical blow. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. For the first time since the interview began, she seemed to truly understand what she'd done. Look, Howard said, his voice softening slightly. You still have a choice here. You can leave, and this becomes the story. The Duchess who couldn't handle a basic interview, who melted down on live radio because someone asked her about privilege. Or you can sit back down and we can try to salvage something from this mess. Meghan stood in the doorway for what felt like an eternity, her internal struggle playing out across her face. Pride warred with pragmatism, anger battled with the dawning realization of how badly she'd handled the situation. Why would you want to salvage anything? She asked finally, her voice smaller than it had been all morning. After what I said about you, Howard shrugged. Because I'm a professional. And despite what just happened, I don't actually enjoy watching people destroy themselves in front of millions of listeners. Millions? Meghan's eyes widened as the full scope of her public meltdown hit her. Satellite radio, terrestrial syndication, podcast downloads, Robin listed helpfully. Plus all the clips that are probably already being uploaded to social media by now. Meghan closed her eyes and leaned against the doorframe. When she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. I can't, she whispered. I can't sit back down and pretend this didn't happen. Nobody's asking you to pretend, Howard said gently. But you could acknowledge it, own it, show people that you're bigger than this moment. But I'm not, Meghan said, her voice breaking completely. Don't you see? This is exactly what they all said would happen, that I couldn't handle the pressure, that I was too weak, too emotional, too much drama. The studio fell silent. Even Howard, master of the uncomfortable moment, seemed unsure how to respond to this raw display of vulnerability. They? Robin asked softly. The royal family, the tabloids, everyone who said I didn't belong. Meghan wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her carefully applied makeup, and now I've proved them right on live radio. Howard studied her face, and for a moment, his expression softened completely. Meghan, you want to know the truth? Everyone has moments like this. Everyone says things they regret when they're backed into a corner. The difference is, most people don't have millions of witnesses. That's supposed to make me feel better? Meghan asked with a bitter laugh. It's supposed to make you human? Howard replied. Look, you came in here with your guard up, ready for a fight. I pushed buttons I probably shouldn't have pushed. We both played our parts in this disaster. Meghan looked at him with surprise. Are you apologizing? I'm acknowledging that I'm not blameless here, Howard said carefully. But I'm not apologizing for doing my job. The questions I asked were fair. How you chose to respond to them, that's on you. The honesty in his voice seemed to break through the last of Meghan's defenses. Her shoulders sagged, and she looked suddenly exhausted. I don't know how to do this, she admitted quietly. How to be a public figure without the protection of the institution. How to answer questions about my life without it feeling like an attack. You learn, Howard said simply. Same way everyone else does, by making mistakes and trying to do better next time. And if there is no next time? Meghan asked. If this is the interview everyone remembers? Howard was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. Then you make sure the next thing you do is so much better that people have something else to talk about. Meghan nodded slowly, finally stepping away from the door. But instead of returning to her chair, she moved toward Howard's desk. I owe you an apology, she said, her voice steady for the first time in 20 minutes. What I said about you being washed up, about attacking women for sport, that was unfair and untrue. You were doing your job, and I made it personal because I couldn't handle the questions. Howard nodded, accepting the apology with grace. And I could have been more sensitive to the fact that you're still learning how to navigate this world without palace handlers. So what happens now? Meghan asked. Howard glanced at the clock on his console, then at his producers through the glass. Now you decide. We've got about 10 minutes left in the hour. You can walk away and let this be the story. Or you can use those 10 minutes to show people who you really are when you're not hiding behind talking points. Meghan looked back at her chair, then at Howard, then at Robin's booth, where the longtime radio personality was watching with curious, supportive eyes. If I stay, Meghan said slowly, if I try to finish this interview properly, will you edit out the worst of what just happened? Howard shook his head. I don't edit interviews. What happens here? Happens. But I will say this. People respect honesty more than perfection. The woman who just admitted she made a mistake and apologized for it is a lot more interesting than the one who walked in here with all the right answers. Meghan took a deep breath, walked back to her chair, and sat down. She picked up the microphone she'd thrown aside and carefully reattached it. Okay, she said, looking directly at Howard. Let's try this again, but this time I promise to actually listen to your questions instead of hearing attacks that aren't there. Howard smiled, the first genuine smile he'd shown all morning. Fair enough. And I promise to remember that not everyone grew up in radio studios learning to take punches. So, Meghan said, settling back in her chair with something approaching her original composure. You asked me how I connect with regular people. Let me give you a real answer this time. And for the remaining 10 minutes of the interview, she did exactly that. She talked honestly about her struggles with identity, about learning to navigate fame without institutional support, and about the mistakes she'd made along the way. It wasn't the polished performance her team had planned, but it was real, and that made all the difference. When the hour was up and they went to commercial break, Howard removed his headphones and looked across the desk at his guest. That, he said simply, was actually pretty good radio. Meghan laughed, a sound that held both relief and exhaustion. Even with the complete meltdown in the middle? Especially because of the complete meltdown in the middle, Howard replied. People don't tune in to hear perfect people have perfect conversations. They tune in to hear real people being real, even when it gets messy. As Meghan gathered her things to leave, she paused at the door one more time. Howard, thank you for giving me the chance to recover from that. Not everyone would have. Everyone deserves a second chance, Howard said, even on the same interview. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Howard alone with Robin and the aftermath of one of the most dramatic interviews in radio history. It had started as a routine celebrity chat and evolved into something much more complex, a real-time study of how public figures handle pressure, how pride can lead to destruction, and how